Evening, friends. I'm Beau LeClaire, and this here's the Dixie Tales, where the Deep South still whispers if you listen close. These are the stories that never made the history books, but live on in the heat, the dust, and the hush between crickets. So pull up a chair, tap that like, and subscribe if you believe some truths are too wild to stay buried. Now, let's begin. They say some songs don't get written, they get found. Dug up like bones from the dirt, humming long before any man ever drew a bow across a string. Georgia's got one of those songs, older than the railroads, older than the state lines carved through red clay and pine. Folks call it the Devil's Tune, though nobody agrees who first played it. Some say it drifted up from the swamps, borne on the breath of night creatures. Others swear it started with a man who made a bargain under a blood-orange moon. Either way, if you stand on the right stretch of dirt road outside Macon when the wind's low and the crickets fall silent, you can still hear it thin as smoke, sharp as regret. That road's nothing fancy. Just a ribbon of gravel winding through whispering pines and kudzu that climbs the trees like it's trying to escape the ground. Locals call it Booker's Crossroads, though no map ever did. The name's older than memory, passed down like a curse. It's where the preacher's boy and the fiddler met. One summer night in the 1800s, when the air was so thick with heat you could slice it. And if you believe the talk that's trickled down a century and a half since, that was the night music itself got damned. Now, I ain't one to gossip, Lord knows. The South's got enough ghosts without me conjuring new ones, but I was raised on these stories, told by men who swore they'd heard the echo themselves. My granddaddy claimed he saw the pine tops bend that night like somebody'd grabbed the wind by its throat. He said the devil don't always come with horns and sulfur. Sometimes he just shows up curious, tapping his boot in time to a tune no angel would dare hum. Back in them days, Georgia was split clean in two cotton kings on one side, dirt farmers on the other, and the line between them drawn with sweat and sin. Towns rose around rail depots and mills, but in the hollers and hill country, the real gatherings happened in barns and clearings lit by kerosene lamps. That's where the fiddles sang. Weddings, wakes, corn shuckings, didn't matter. A man could starve half the week, but if he could make a bow dance, folks'd feed him just to hear that sorrow twist into joy. Music was the only magic most ever saw. One such man was Silas Reed, born poor, barefoot, and hungry for something bigger than the life laid before him. His daddy worked turpentine in the pines. His mama washed for the white folks in Macon. They didn't have much but a patch of dirt and a second-hand fiddle missing a string. Silas found it in the rafters of a sharecropper's shed when he was 8, wiped off the dust, and swore it hummed on its own. By 12, he could mimic a church hymn from memory. By 16, he could make women cry and men drink faster. Folks said the boy played like he'd been taught by ghosts, but talent's a dangerous thing when it blooms in hard soil. The more Silas played, the stranger folks looked at him. Some said his bow never needed rosin because it was slicked with sin. Others whispered that he'd been seen out past midnight, playing for shadows that danced without bodies. He didn't mind the talk. Every story put more coins in his pocket. Still, there was one man who took offense at it all. Eli Booker, son of Reverend Josiah Booker, pastor of Mount Olive Baptist and self-appointed guardian of every soul within 10 miles. Eli had been raised to fear temptation, especially the kind that came wrapped in rhythm. The Reverend called music Satan's sermon, save for hymns sung proper on Sunday. But the boy had an ear the good book couldn't cure. He'd sneak down to the colored quarter after sundown, linger by open windows, listening to fiddles and washboards thumping like human hearts. What he heard in those nights tore at him. The pull between holiness and hunger. Silas Reed and Eli Booker met the way fire meets dry grass accidentally, but bound to burn. Some say it was at a harvest dance held on the edge of town. Others say at a revival meeting when Silas wandered too close with his fiddle case slung over his shoulder. However it happened, the preacher's boy heard that bow scrape once and felt his knees go weak. The tune Silas played wasn't fast nor slow. It moved like a sermon gone sideways, holy and wicked at once. When he finished, Eli clapped before he could stop himself, and half the crowd turned to stare. Didn't know the Reverend's son fancied heathen music, someone muttered. Eli blushed, but Silas just smiled a sly curve that said, "You understand me better than your father ever will." From that night on, the two were bound, though not by friendship. Jealousy's a cousin to admiration, and both feed on pride. Eli swore he'd learn to outplay the fiddler, to prove that righteousness could match devilry note for note. The county fair came that summer, bringing with it gamblers, tinkers, and every sort of sinner who could afford the entry fee. Among them was a man dressed too fine for the dust, black coat, silver buttons, eyes dark as polished coal. He carried no instrument, yet walked like he was keeping time to a tune only he could hear. Folks noticed the way dogs avoided him and how his shadow didn't quite match his stride. He set up near the Crossroads with a sign that read simply, "A wager for the gifted." Silas found him first. Pride'll drag a man anywhere. The stranger said he'd been looking for a player fit to test heaven's patience. Offered a violin carved from wood darker than mahogany, strings glinting like wire drawn from moonlight. Said whoever played it best would own it and whatever gift came with it forever. Eli showed up not an hour later, sweat darkening his Sunday shirt, eyes fevered. Maybe the devil didn't have to search for souls in Georgia. They walked right up and introduced themselves. That's how the legend begins, or so the old men at the feed store tell it when the thunder's rollin' far off. They say Silas and Eli agreed to meet again, 1 week to the day, when the moon was full and the air hung still as judgment. The place, Booker's Crossroads. The prize, the stranger's violin. Granddaddy always said the wind died that whole week, like the world holding its breath. The animals wouldn't graze, the well water turned warm, and preachers from Milledgeville to Savannah warned their congregations about the wages of vanity. But words don't stop fate once it starts hummin'. The night finally came, mid-July, heat lightning flickering over the treetops. Folks snuck out of their houses, following the rumors, till near 50 souls stood ringed around the clearing. Silas wore his daddy's threadbare vest. Eli came in white sleeves rolled, Bible still in his coat pocket like armor. Between them, the stranger waited, that black violin gleaming like oil under the lanterns. He spoke just once, voice smooth as molasses, that poured over ice. "Play what's in your heart," he said. "But mind you, what's in there might not be what you think." Then he stepped back into the shadows, and the crowd parted like wheat before the scythe. Silas drew his bow first. The sound that came wasn't mortal. It rolled through the trees like thunder bottled and released, set the pine needles shivering. Birds took flight, though it was near midnight. The tune twisted between major and minor like it couldn't make up its mind whether to praise or curse. When he finished, the air itself seemed to gasp. Eli stepped forward, trembling but determined. His first note broke, the second wavered, but by the third, something caught hold of him. He played amazing, grace slow, trembling, then faster, until it barely resembled the hymn. Sweat poured down his face. The bow smoked from friction. He closed his eyes, every ounce of guilt and yearning spilling out through those strings. The crowd didn't breathe. That's when the stranger laughed, low, pleased. "Fine beginnings," he said, "but the night ain't over." He lifted the black fiddle, handed it to Silas. "See if your fingers can bear truth." Silas hesitated only a second before taking it. The wood felt warm, pulsing faintly, like a living thing. He raised the bow, and a note sliced the dark clean open. The sound carried farther than sound ought to, down creeks, across fields, into dreams of men miles away. Women at home stirred in their sleep, whispering prayers they didn't know. By the time the tune ended, the lanterns had gone out, though nobody'd touched them. Only the fireflies remained, glowing weak and red as embers. The crowd backed away, some crossing themselves, others running outright. When light returned, dawn bleeding through the trees, there was no sign of the stranger. No black fiddle, just Eli on his knees, eyes glazed like he'd seen heaven or hell and couldn't tell which. Silas lay face down beside, and him bow still clutched tight, strings snapped clean. That's where the sheriff found them hours later. Eli lived long enough to whisper one thing. He said he'd be back when the songs forgot. They buried Silas Reed at the edge of Booker's Crossroads. No headstone, just a cedar post. The preacher resigned before year's end. But the tune didn't die. Travelers passing that way swore they heard it on the wind. Faint, but sharp, like memory refusing to rest. And so began the legend that Georgia still can't shake, the devil's violinist, the man who played one note too true and bought eternity for it. Silas Reed wasn't born to fame nor fortune, but to a house that leaned when the wind did. Folks said the walls creaked hymns if you listened long enough, and the floorboards remembered every argument that ever passed across them. His daddy, Amos Reed, worked turpentine up in Twiggs County, scraping resin from pine trunks till his hands cracked and bled. His mama, Lila, May, sang in the colored church on Sundays. Voice so sweet you'd forget the roof leaked. They didn't own much more than a mule and a kettle, but they had rhythm, and in the South, rhythm could make hunger bearable. Silas came squalling into the world one May morning in 1847. The same year thunder took out half the cotton crop. The midwife said lightning struck near the cabin right as he drew his first breath. Lila May took that as a sign not of danger, but destiny. Child come into this world with the storm behind him, she'd say, rocking him on the porch while the pines sighed overhead. Best learn to dance with thunder, or it'll chase you your whole life. By 6, Silas had turned every pot lid and broom handle in the house into an instrument. He'd drum on tin buckets, pluck wire strings strung from fence posts, hum to the rhythm of the cicadas, until even the old hound lifted his head to listen. The sound that came out of him wasn't learned, it was born. When his daddy found that half-broke fiddle in an abandoned wagon and handed it over, the boy treated it like a relic. It was missing its E-string, warped from heat and time, but when Silas drew a bent pine bow across it, the air changed. The sound was cracked, raw, a note that wobbled between sorrow and joy, like it didn't know which it preferred. He practiced till his fingers blistered and the neighbors complained about that racket from the Reed boy. But even the ones who grumbled would linger by the fence come sundown, pretending to check their mules while they listened. By 10, he was playing dances. By 14, funerals. The kind of funerals where folks needed music to cry to. They said he could stretch a single note long enough to make time stop. There was something in that sound wild, unchurched, but not wicked either. It made the heart ache the way truth does, and that's what scared people most. Because music that makes a man feel too much will make him question everything else he believes in. The Reverend Josiah Booker didn't like that one bit. He was a man of brimstone and boundaries, shepherd of Mount Olive Baptist, and he considered fiddles the devil's tuning fork. He'd stand in the pulpit, fist thudding against the Bible, preaching that string music stirs the flesh while killin' the soul. His son Eli sat front row every Sunday, jaw clenched, eyes full of confusion. He'd heard Silas play once at the spring picnic, just one song, Soldier's Joy, and afterward he couldn't sleep for a week. The melody lingered in his bones like sin. The Reed and Booker families lived not 10 miles apart but worlds away. The Reeds worked the land the Bookers owned, and that invisible line of class and color stretched between them like a tripwire. Still, Silas and Eli met by accident one afternoon when a summer storm rolled in, sudden as temper. Silas had been out near the creek, trying to find resin logs left behind by his daddy's crew. When rain came down in sheets, he ducked into an old smokehouse to wait it out, only to find Eli already there, clutching a Bible and a look of guilt. "Didn't mean to intrude," Silas said, water dripping from his hat brim. Eli shook his head. "Ain't your fault. Storm don't pick sides." For a while they just listened to the rain drumming on the tin roof. That steady beat no man could imitate. Silas, being Silas, started to tap his foot, then hum, then draw his bow slow across the strings. The sound filled that little shack like prayer. Eli's eyes softened. He mouthed the rhythm without realizing it. "That's sinful music," Eli muttered finally, half to himself. "Maybe," Silas said, "but it sure feels like it's forgiven me for something." That was the first spark of friendship or rivalry, depending who tells it. From then on, Eli started sneaking down to the Reed place under the pretense of charity work. He'd and bring old hymnals, saying he was teaching the reeds to read scripture, but he always ended up with that fiddle in his hands. Silas would show him finger placements, little tricks about bow pressure. Eli had a good ear but a stiff wrist. His notes came out clean, righteous, and lifeless. Silas told him, "You gotta let the sin in a little, else it don't breathe." That line stuck like a splinter. Rumors started, as they always do. The Reverend caught wind that his son was spending afternoons with that Reed boy and his heathen racket. One Sunday he thundered from the pulpit that music born of vanity was the devil's whisper, and that those who played for applause were already marked. Folks nodded, but more than one stole glances toward Eli, whose face burned crimson. After the service, he found Silas waitin' by the well, and said, "You made me a liar in the Lord's house." Silas just smiled slow. "Didn't make you nothin'. Just played what's already in you." From that day on, it turned from friendship to contest. Every gathering became a quiet duel, one hymn versus one hoedown, one plea for heaven against one temptation for hell. People came to see them both, the preacher's boy and the fiddler who wouldn't bow to God or man. Wagers were made, sides were taken. Georgia loves a feud almost as much as it loves redemption. But what truly set tongues wagging was the night Silas played out by the old train depot. The war had ended not long before, and men were still hobbling home half whole. The town held a celebration, small but proud. Lanterns hung from the oaks, barrels of cider lined up on sawhorses. When Silas took the stage, just a plank laid over crates, the crowd hushed. He didn't announce the tune, just started. The bow moved so fast you couldn't see it, only the glint of the string and the rise of dust around his boots. The music came like fire caught in a jar, wild, bright, dangerous. A soldier's widow fainted. 2 men fought in the back, and then made peace mid-song. When he stopped, there was silence like after lightning, before the thunder comes. Then applause, loud and reckless. That's when the stranger was first seen. Tall man, in a black coat, though it was still August heat. He leaned against a post at the edge of the crowd, head bowed, smiling like he'd been waiting centuries to hear that tune. When Silas stepped down, the man tipped his hat and said one thing, "You play like you know what waits beneath." Then he walked off into the night. Silas asked around, but nobody else claimed to have seen him. The barkeep swore there wasn't any man in black that night. "Must have been a shadow," he said. But Silas didn't sleep right for weeks after that. Every time he picked up the fiddle, he swore he heard another bow moving just behind his, out of rhythm and yet somehow perfect. Meanwhile, Eli practiced harder, driven near mad by envy. His father caught him one night, bowing in the parlor after midnight, and in a rage smashed the fiddle clean across his knee. The next morning, Eli walked into town, hands bleeding, and bought another. "I'll play till heaven listens," he told the storekeeper. By the time summer turned to fall, word spread through 3 counties that a contest was brewing. Not a fairground sort, but a real test one that'd prove who the Lord favored and who played for darker company. Some said Eli challenged Silas outright. Others claimed it was Silas who sent the invitation, pride swollen and hungry. Either way, everyone knew where it had happened. At the crossroads between their lands. That fork of red clay, where 4 pines stood like pillars to judgment. Old folks whispered about that spot long before the duel. Said the ground never grew grass right. Horses balked there. Travelers heard whispers even when alone. Slaves once refused to pass it after sundown, claiming they'd seen a man with no face sitting on a log, humming low. That's why, when the younger men cleared it for the match, even the bravest felt the air change. Silas laughed at superstition, said, "Music's the only spirit I'm callin'." But the night before the duel, he dreamed of that black-coated man again. Only this time, the man was playing the old fiddle, his fiddle, and every note made the stars dim. He woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, fingers twitching like they'd been moving in sleep. He didn't tell a soul. Pride'll silence a man faster than fear. Come morning, he sat on the porch with his mama, stringing the bow fresh. She looked at him with those tired eyes that see farther than most men's reason. "Boy," she said, "music's just prayer with teeth. Be careful which side you bite with." Silas kissed her cheek, laughed soft. "Don't you worry, Mama. I only play what's true." Lila May sighed. "That's what scares me." That afternoon, he walked the old road toward Booker's Crossroads, fiddle case in hand, the sun bleeding out behind him like a slow wound. He didn't see the man in black step out from the pines, but he felt the air turning colder in a 10-foot circle, cicadas going quiet. "Evenin', Mr. Reed," the voice said. "Reckon you'll be needin' this." And when Silas turned, the stranger was gone, but a new bow lay in the dust, hair fine as silver, handle carved with symbols that shimmered when the light hit. He picked it up before he could think better. The wood pulsed warm under his palm, heartbeat steady as his own. He knew then the stories were right. Some tunes find you. When he reached the crossroads, Eli was already there, sleeves rolled, lanterns hung, Bible resting on a stump. The crowd formed quick, drawn like moths. Nobody spoke above a whisper. They say the night air itself held its breath. And with that, the stage was set for the devil to listen close. Eli Booker grew up in a house where faith was hammered, harder than nails. His father, Reverend Josiah Booker, ruled both pulpit and table with the same iron grip, quoting scripture as law and wielding guilt like a weapon. The Booker home smelled of starch, lamp oil, and judgment. Each morning began with prayer. Each night ended with warning. Music, unless it rose from the church organ, was considered sin with a melody. Eli absorbed those lessons early, repeating them like verses carved into his bones. Yet beneath that obedience ran another current, quiet, restless, and dangerous. On humid nights, when his father's voice thundered through the church walls, Eli listened past it to the faint hum from the colored quarter beyond the fields. Fiddles and tambourines carried through the pine trees, pulsing with life no sermon could imitate. The rhythm stirred something that prayer never reached. By adolescence, Eli had mastered the posture of holiness, but not its peace. His father praised his discipline. The congregation admired his composure, but the boy's spirit itched beneath its Sunday clothes. What he felt was hunger, not for food or flesh, but for the freedom that came with sound unbound by Scripture. The first time he saw Silas Reed play, that hunger found its shape. It was a harvest gathering, the kind the Reverend tolerated only because it filled the donation plate. Silas stood on a crate with his fiddle, bow flashing in lantern light, every note thick with sweat and sorrow. Eli watched from the edge of the crowd, torn between fascination and shame. The melody climbed and broke, not like a hymn, but like a confession without words. When it ended, applause rippled through the clearing, and Eli realized his hands were trembling. From that night on, he could not unhear it. The tune seeped into his sleep, returning in fevered fragments. He began to practice secretly on an old fiddle he'd found in the church attic, one meant for wedding processions before his father banned such frivolity. At first, his playing was stiff, mechanical, as if he feared the bow might bite. But obsession is a patient tutor. Within months he could reproduce hymns, then alter them, stretching the rhythms, twisting the key until piety bled into passion. When Reverend Booker discovered the deception, the punishment was swift. The instrument was splintered against the hearth. Eli was sent to his knees till dawn. But humiliation only deepened the craving. What the Reverend destroyed in wood, he built in will. The son began sneaking to the creek after sundown, practicing with borrowed instruments, teaching his fingers to move like flame over water. Each night the air filled with the same question, unspoken but heavy. Could holiness and hunger ever share the same breath? In town, word of the preacher's boy learning the devil's trade spread fast. Some pitied him, others waited for the scandal to bloom. In a land that lived on rumor, Eli became both cautionary tale and secret inspiration. Respectable daughters blushed when his name was spoken. Farmhands carved bets into barn beams, predicting which Sunday he'd finally be cast from the pulpit steps. Silas Reed heard the whispers too. For a time, he ignored them. Then curiosity took hold. He began to test his rival through the only language he trusted: sound. At gatherings, he played louder, faster, bending strings till they howled. Each performance carried challenge in its rhythm, a dare flung across the fields toward Mount Olive's steeple. And though Eli never answered in words, he listened. The duel had already begun, silent and relentless. The Reverend's sermons grew harsher as the gossip thickened. He spoke of pride, of men who mistook talent for grace, of music as temptation disguised as beauty. The congregation nodded, but their eyes drifted toward Eli, seated front row, jaw set in defiance he no longer cared to hide. One evening, the Reverend confronted his son in the yard, the air heavy with the scent of rain and magnolia. Neighbors later said they heard shouting followed by the crack of something breaking. When Eli emerged alone, the porch lamp glowed behind him like a halo twisted into flame. The next morning he was gone from the house, leaving only the torn pages of a hymnal scattered on the floor. For weeks, he wandered between farms, offering to play at wakes and weddings, anything that would buy him time and quiet. The fiddle he carried now was borrowed from a drifter heading west, its varnish worn thin, strings tuned to sorrow. His music shifted in tone, less polished, more desperate. It bore the weight of rebellion and the ache of exile. When word reached him that Silas Reed was performing nightly at the Macon Depot, drawing crowds large enough to drown the preacher's sermons, Eli's pride turned to fury. Every song Silas played seemed to mock him, every cheer a reminder that piety had left him forgotten. He began to speak of a reckoning, not with rage but with conviction, the need to prove that holiness could command as much awe as sin. As summer waned, the two men's paths drew together like rivers feeding a storm. The challenge between them no longer needed to be spoken. Both understood what waited at Booker's Crossroads. For Silas, it was a test of mastery. For Eli, a trial of faith. One sought to ascend through music, the other to redeem it. In the days before the duel, Eli prepared like a soldier facing judgment. He fasted, read scripture until his eyes blurred, and practiced in secret beneath the oaks behind the church. Witnesses claimed they heard strange harmonies drifting from those woods, psalms twisted into minor keys, notes trembling as if they resisted being born. By dusk, even the birds refused to settle in the branches above him. When he stepped out on the final morning, the townsfolk saw a change. His face carried the calm of a man who had already made peace with consequence. He wore his father's white shirt, sleeves rolled high, and carried his fiddle without shame. Behind him, the church bell tolled for vespers, though no hand pulled the rope. At sundown, Eli Booker reached the crossroads. Silas was already there, bow poised, crowd gathered in a ring of flickering lanterns. The preacher's son did not flinch. He walked to the center of the clearing and bowed once not to his rival, not to the crowd, but to the instrument itself, as if offering confession. Those who watched said the air went still when the two men raised their bows. Between them hung a silence thick enough to drown a prayer. Some claimed the Reverend stood at the tree line, face pale, lips moving soundlessly. Others swore a third figure lingered in the shadows, a man too still for breath, eyes glinting red in the lamplight. Eli's heart pounded steady, his faith coiled tight within his chest. All that he had resisted, feared, and desired came to meet him in that single moment. The bow touched string, and Georgia held its breath. The day bled into evening with the day bled, slow certainty of a sentence being carried out. Heat hung low in the branches, and thunder moved along the horizon without hurry, as if the sky had chosen to witness what the ground had arranged. By late afternoon, the roads toward Booker's Crossroads began to carry more than wagons and mule carts. They carried expectation. Men drifted in from fields wearing the day's dust. Women came in pairs with shawls pulled tight against a heat that needed no shawl. Children were hauled back home by stern hands and sent to bed early, then slipped out again, small shadows doubling the larger ones. Even the dogs followed the current of rumor, tails down, tongues lolling, uneasy in the strange quiet that rose from the pines. The clearing itself had changed. Hours earlier, farmhands had stomped the grass flat and tied lanterns to 4 tall pines at the compass points, glass chimneys ready to hold back the dark. Somebody dragged 2 sawhorses into a rough platform, not a stage so much as a boundary drawn chest-high in the dust. Another set a water bucket near the stump that locals used as a makeshift pulpit during outdoor revivals. The bucket would not be touched. A cricket chorus swelled and then faltered, thinning into a ragged tremolo as the first onlookers stepped beneath the trees. The scent of resin and iron-rich clay mingled with lamp oil. It smelled like a workshop where something dangerous was being built. Silas Reed arrived without ceremony, carrying the old case that had grown up with him like a second spine. Turpentine scars on his hands caught lantern light in pale slashes. He did not search the crowd for allies. There were none to find that could help. He set the case on the sawhorses and stood with head bowed, not in prayer but in measurement, tasting the air the way a smith tastes smoke before striking. There was a tempo in the night already, a pulse beneath the cicadas, and he listened until his breath matched it. Around him, murmurs braided into one, continuous thread. A few men tried to grin bravely and could not hold it. A few women crossed themselves with hands that shook. Eli Booker came from the road that led past Mount Olive, his father's church a dim geometry far behind. He wore the formal white of Sunday stripped of its sanctimony, sleeves rolled, throat bare, hair combed with more care than vanity. Beneath the white, sweat darkened the cloth at the small of his back, and the narrow muscles in his forearms moved with the vigilance of coiled rope. He carried his fiddle in the crook of his arm the way a soldier carries a rifle when the soil ahead is mined. When he stepped into the lantern wash, some in the crowd exhaled as if they had been holding breath since noon. The Reverend stood back from the ring of light, his face the color of bone in shadow, lips shaping words that carried nowhere. Whether he begged heaven or warned it, the pine tops did not report. A third presence seemed to rise as the sun dropped, not a man. Entering the clearing, not a figure anyone could swear to later, but a pressure, as if the ground itself leaned in at the edges. Those nearest the north lantern found its flame tall and steady against a wind that had not been felt. Those nearest the southern light saw their own breath briefly in air too warm to allow it. A few observers glanced toward the tree line and stiffened, convinced they had seen a darker darkness tucked between trunks. No one called it by name. Naming had already been done for them by a century of warnings. The crowd widened itself into a circle as if pulled outward by an invisible centrifuge. Within the ring, between sawhorses and stump, the dirt was smooth and clean of footprints. A page waiting for ink. Silas opened his case and took out the instrument that had begun as a toy and grown into his confession. He checked the bridge, the pegs, the grain where 100 nights had left polish. He rosined the bow with practiced care, the cake turning to soft dust that lifted and fell like moth wings. At the edge of hearing, another sound brushed the air like bow hair drawn across string from a distance, a ghosted rehearsal in a neighboring room. Several faces turned toward the same patch of trees and then away together, as if a conductor had cued them. Eli unlatched his own case and lifted a fiddle that wore its varnish thin along the treble side, a mark left by hours spent pressing into desire and discipline. He did not test a note. He placed the instrument against his neck, found the chin rest without looking, and set the bow down upon the string without drawing. Musicians who have lived with their instruments long enough do not need the reassurance of sound before beginning. The wood assures them. Weight and balance, speaking in a language older than comfort. No master of ceremonies stepped forward, no speech cut the air. The duel began the way a storm begins, first with pressure, then with the smallest, certain release. Silas drew a line of sound that started almost as breath and thickened until the lantern glass trembled in its wire frame. The tone had grain in it, a grit that gave the sweetness teeth. He threaded a melody built on dance figures the crowd knew in their bones, reels, and jigs the land had tamed. Then he warped them, stretching intervals until the familiar showed its seams. Feet that had started to tap paused mid-beat, unsure where to land. In the interval that followed, a woman near the eastern lantern sobbed once and covered her mouth as if the sound had slipped from her by treachery. Eli raised his bow before the last vibration had died. He answered not with speed but with a held note that matched the pitch at its dying height, refusing to let it fall. That refusal built its own authority. When he finally released, he released into structure a hymn form recomposed with the deliberate gravity of liturgy. The fragments of devotion were clear enough to be recognized and altered enough to make recognition ache. He lifted into a minor turn that pulled the stomach tight, then resolved with a cadence so narrow it felt like a ledge. Several in the crowd nodded without intending to. the way congregants do during a sermon that lays a hand on a bruise they have carried for years. Silas returned with motion and danger. The bow began to blur. Triplets cut into the dirt like spurs. He angled the instrument to draw 2 strings at once and built a bell of sound that seemed to ring from the center of the clearing outward. When the rhythm broke, it broke forward, not down, stumbling on purpose, catching itself with the agility of a man who has learned to fall and turn the fall into dance. The lanterns leaned toward him, though their ropes held fast. Pine needles hissed softly, a million small tongues whispering through resin. Across from him, Eli held his ground and began to climb. He moved up the neck into registers that could pierce a heart without touching it. The crowd shifted as one, being spines lengthening, heads tilting, faces lifted the way fields of wheat lift into a breeze. The melody he chose did not plead. It insisted. It insisted that order could match passion, that form could carry fire without bursting. The Reverend's hands dropped to his sides, empty. The shape of surrender or the shape of awe, depending on who watched. The earth answered. A tremor passed through the dirt underfoot. Not an earthquake, but the sigh of old clay, remembering hooves and chains and steps taken under orders. The bucket by the stump rippled and then stilled. Moths circled the glass of the western lantern and refused to burn. In the line of trees beyond the north light, something taller than a man leaned without moving. Children who had crept nearer found themselves returned to the ring's edge without recalling how they had walked back. Somewhere, far off, a dog barked once and then lay down. Silas shifted his stance and took the risk that separates virtuosity from survival. He drove the melody into a place where the intervals widened beyond comfort and then refused to close again. In that refusal, a shape emerged, an old field holler hidden inside a European figure, a scrap of grieving woven into bravado. The South's dialect lodged inside a borrowed tongue. Shoulders in the crowd squared and then slumped, the body's involuntary answer to recognition. The night pulled closer around him until sound, air, and dark felt like 3 versions of the same element. Eli answered by stripping away flourish and leaving bone. The bow slowed, weight increased, tone thickened until it resembled a voice speaking without words. What lived in him that had been pressed flat by years of instruction lifted its head and took breath. People who had come to witness a contest began to watch a testimony. This was not victory music, it was reckoning. The crickets stopped entirely, a silence so complete it made the blood in the ear audible. At the very center of the duel, both men reached for something neither could own alone. Silas found a figure that felt like a door unlatched in a house he had not been invited to enter. Eli found a dissonance that tasted like metal and lightning and judgment delayed. Sound rose, overlapped, ground against itself, until a third thing appeared between them, an invisible column, a braided current, a narrow highway, upright as a pillar, threaded with harmonics that did not belong to either melody. The crowd sensed it without understanding and edged backward as if heat had reached them from a fire not yet visible. The pillar broke with a sound too low to be heard and too heavy to be ignored. In that fracture, the western lantern went out and relit on its own, wick brighter than before, glass fogged from within. A few onlookers dropped to their knees without volition. Someone attempted to shout and produced only breath. The Reverend's eyes filled and emptied in a rhythm separate from his heartbeat. Beyond the ring, the shape among the trees inclined its head, as if the entertainment had met threshold. The final exchanges carried the inevitability of weather. Silas, whose body knew risk as grammar, threw bow and fingers to the edge of what the wood would bear. A string frayed audibly, a thin thread of hair fluttering from the bow like shed skin. He gave the instrument everything the years had hardened and softened inside him, and the night paid attention. Eli, whose life had been an argument against what his hands now confessed, locked his stance and drove a cadence like a stake. When he reached the last measures, he held them in the air a heartbeat too long, daring gravity to object. It did not. He set the tonic down so carefully that the sound completed the shape it had carved and sealed it. No one clapped. Applause would have been impolite in the presence of whatever else had gathered. The final vibration spun out into the pines and then dropped into the ground like rain into sand. For several breaths, the crowd stood inside a silence that felt upholstered rather than empty. Then the sounds of the ordinary world returned in untidy order. A cough, a whimper, a lantern chain ticking as the glass cooled. What came next belonged to rumor even that same hour. Some remembered a violin darker than any wood they knew, cradled briefly in hands no one could agree existed. Some recalled the crack of a string snapping in the instant before dawn, and a smear of soot on the sawhorse none had placed there. Many agreed on two bodies at the center. One, upright and still, face lifted to the canopy as if listening for a reply that refused to speak. Bow hand clenched so hard the knuckles had gone pale as linen. When the sheriff pushed to the front with men bearing a shutter for a stretcher, birds began to call as if it were any other morning. The road out of the clearing filled with slow feet and fast stories. The lanterns were snuffed, the bucket tipped, the stump left where it had always stood. The pines resumed their whispering as though they had merely paused to hear a long sentence end. By noon the crossroads looked almost unchanged to anyone who did not know where to look. To those who did, the dirt showed a faint, polished circle where two sets of boots had ground a ritual into the earth, and the air held a taste of iron that wind could not quite carry away. Georgia kept the night in its mouth for years afterward. Travelers claimed to hear a thread of melody on still evenings, a line of sound finer than spider silk and strong enough to snare a memory by the throat. Mothers told restless children that certain paths should be avoided after dusk because some notes, once played, do not finish. Preachers warned that pride dresses itself in beauty, and that beauty, when ungoverned, courts companions with hooves. Fiddlers tuned more carefully before stepping on a plank and felt their fingers hesitate briefly above the string where the neck meets trust. The duel was over. The story was not. Morning did not wash the night clean. It only laid a thinner light over what had happened and hoped the details would blur. The sun rose pale through a veil of cloud, and the air felt scraped out, as if the wind had spent itself arguing with something it could not move. At Booker's Crossroads, dew clung to the trampled grass in beads that looked too much like sweat. The lanterns hung cold and still, soot tracing their chimneys where flame had once strained upward. Word of the duel ran faster than wagons. By mid-morning, every porch from Macon to the far farms carried a version. Some told of fire leaping from strings, of sparks that never fell but hung above the men like a crown. Others insisted the pines had bent inward during the final measures, branches knitting a roof over the clearing so dense not a star could be seen. The truth, once wrapped in that many tongues, no longer belonged entirely to fact. Yet beneath the embellishments, certain details refused to change. Two fiddlers had met. One lay in the dust when the music ended. The other stood as if listening to a sound no one else could hear. Something more than competition had passed through that ring of dirt. Silas Reed's body told its own story. There were no cuts, no bruises beyond the usual scrapes of a man who lived in work clothes. His heart had stopped, that was all, as if a hand had reached into his chest and pinched out the flame. His fingers still curled around the bough with such force that it took the sheriff and two farmhands to pry them open. When they did, the hair on the bow was worn thin in one spot, a bald place as though an invisible edge had sawn through it from the other side. The fiddle itself lay intact, but one string had snapped, not in frayed wisps, but in a clean, sharp break. The ends looked seared rather than torn. The sheriff, a practical man who counted his cents in tally with his years, declared it a failure of the heart. Hard living, hard and playing, the strain of too much heat and too little rest. The Reverend Booker said nothing. He watched them lift Silas onto a makeshift board and carry him toward the Reed cabin, his eyes fixed not on the body but on the ground where the last notes had been flung. Eli stood near the stump, shoulders rigid, jaw hollowed, violin hanging limp at his side. Those who tried to speak to him later recalled that he seemed to be listening more than thinking, as if someone else's footsteps were trailing behind his on the inside. Silas's burial took place the next day beneath a sky heavy with unshed rain. The Reeds could not afford a stone, so a cedar post was driven into the earth at the grave's head, its bark still sticky with sap. Neighbors gathered in a thin ring, hats in hand, faces set in that solemn shape the South wore for every loss, great or small. No church choir came, no official hymn was sanctioned. Yet as the first shovelfuls of dirt struck the coffin lid, a sound rose from the edges of the crowd. It was wordless, half hum, half moan, woven from the throats of women who had danced to Silas's tunes and now found their feet leaden. The melody they made did not match any psalm. It moved in the spaces between notes, a mourning that carried the outline of the man's music without daring to repeat it. The tune from the duel did not die with him. It lingered, first in glimpses, then in patterns that were too consistent to be dismissed as imagination. A week after the burial, a farmer driving his wagon along the road near the Crossroads reined in his mule without knowing why. The animal had stopped of its own accord, ears flicking, head cocked toward the trees. The man heard it then, faint as breath, a thin ribbon of sound curling through the pines. It was not a full melody, just a few measures looping over themselves, like a sentence stuck on its most dangerous word. When he later tried to hum it, nothing came. His tongue fumbled, his memory slid off it like water off oiled cloth. All that remained was the feeling, a mixture of awe and unease, the sense that something had looked up when it should have stayed sleeping. Similar accounts followed. A woman hanging laundry near dusk felt her hands slow as a distant strain reached her ears. The cloth in her grasp grew heavier, the lines sagged, and for a moment she stood in the yard with her heart pounding as if she had been running. A boy sent to fetch water from a well half a mile from the Crossroads returned pale, sloshing half his bucket, unable to explain why he had dropped to his knees on the path when a sound like a fiddle played in reverse rolled over the fields. None of them could reproduce the notes. Each described instead the effect: a tightening in the chest, a prickling at the nape of the neck, the sudden vivid awareness of every wrong step ever taken. In the weeks that followed, supper tables buzzed with speculation. Some insisted the devil had come to collect and left a fragment of his voice behind. Others argued that the tune belonged to Silas alone, a final echo of his gift refusing to be silenced. A smaller number, lower in volume but firmer in conviction, believed heaven had been shaken as well as earth, that the music had struck something high above that was slow to settle back into place. For a brief span of measures, they said, the distance between the sacred and the profane had thinned dangerously. The most unsettling reports came from those who claimed the tune altered other sounds around it. A mill hand walking home late swore that the creak of the wheel and the clack of the gears had fallen into the same rhythm he had heard at the duel, as if the machinery had been recruited into a larger score. A child half asleep in a cabin downwind of the Crossroads woke in tears, unable to say what frightened him, only that the wind outside had begun to whistle in a pattern that felt like it knew his name. Storm gutters rattled on roofs in odd syncopation. Church bells, when rung for Sunday service, produced an extra overtone, a faint, dissonant shimmer that died away as quickly as it arrived. Reverend Booker addressed the matter once from the pulpit. His sermon spoke of pride, of bargains made unseen, of the danger in seeking glory through any means but the narrow, prescribed path. The congregation listened, but their thoughts drifted. Many had stood in that clearing, had felt the ground breathe and the air tighten. The minister's words fell like sand against something carved in harder grain. When the service ended, the usual knot of parishioners gathered to shake his hand, but a wider circle lingered outside beneath the oaks, recounting not his warning, but their own memories of the night when sound had seemed to come from somewhere deeper than wood and string. Eli moved through those days like a man walking underwater. Work was done, chores were tended, responses were given when pressed for them. Yet he maintained a constant and inward tilt, as if leaning toward a voice only he could hear. Alone, he roamed the edges of the fields and the corridor of pines leading back to the Crossroads. His fiddle remained with him, but he played less often and with a strangeness that unsettled those who overheard. The hymns he attempted broke apart mid-phrase, bending unintentionally toward the contour of that forbidden tune, then snapping back as if jerked on a chain. Children who passed him on the road looked back twice and hurried their steps without knowing why. At night, the tune did not confine itself to the countryside. In town, behind shuttered windows, men lying awake heard faint music threaded into the restless clatter of thoughts. It faded the moment they tried to grasp it. Women stirring banked fires before dawn sometimes paused, poker in hand, certain that the crackle of the coals had briefly aligned itself into a pattern that did not belong to chance. Even the train whistle, when it split the air along the bell, Macon line, carried at its tail a fleeting, off-kilter interval that sounded less like mechanical cry and more like a human voice caught between plea and defiance. The old people noticed, and the old people worried. They muttered that the land remembers what it witnesses and that some events leave grooves too deep to smooth over. Crossroads had always been considered thin places, where paths, destinies, and hungers intersected. To play that kind of music there, at that hour, under eyes seen and unseen, had been to carve a new channel in already fragile soil. Water, they knew. Spirits were not much different. There was another piece to the legend that took longer to surface. Months after the duel, a traveling musician passing through Georgia stopped at a boarding house near the county line. He brought with him a fiddle and a talent that had earned him coins in taverns from Savannah to the Carolina hills. As was custom, the locals pressed him to play after supper. He obliged, warming the room with reels and ballads, the sort of tunes that oiled conversation and loosened shoulders. Then, without warning, his hand faltered, and his bow fell into a phrase he had not chosen. The room changed. Laughter thinned. A serving girl dropped a plate. The innkeeper's hands went slack on the bar. The pattern was familiar to them, though none could name where they had heard it. It curled through the air with the same unsettling combination of beauty and threat. The player stopped abruptly, sweat starting on his brow. He swore later that he had not learned that sequence anywhere, that it had reached up through his fingers like water through a cracked floorboard. He left town at first light and avoided Georgia thereafter. Stories like that spread, each retelling adding a layer, but always circling the same core. The tune from Booker's Crossroads had become a contagion. It surfaced where strings met sweat and intention slipped for half a heartbeat. It did not need to be remembered in full. It only needed a moment of inattention, a brief raw place in a musician's guard, to leak a fragment into the world. The fragment carried with it the flavor of that night: pride, fear, longing, and the awareness of an audience beyond the human ring. Years later, when a song about the devil and a fiddler made its way onto stages and radio waves, folks in the old county shook their heads with a knowing unease. The tale in the lyrics was not the same as what had happened under the Georgia pines. The names were different, the contest framed for modern ears, but there was something in the way the bow ran wild over the strings, something in the way the melody strutted on the edge of danger, that felt like a grandchild of the older story. The tune had traveled, changed clothes, and learned new words. Underneath the polish, though, lay the same narrow bridge between courage and hubris. Heaven, if it had been rattled that night, did not speak on the matter. The sky continued to pour rain and lightning over Georgia with its usual indifference. Churches remained standing. Fields sprouted. Babies cried and were comforted. Life rolled forward. Yet on some evenings, when the crickets fell silent for no good reason and the air grew tight as an unwritten vow, those who knew where to listen could sense it. A line of music stretched thin between earth and something watching. It shook nothing now, not visibly. It simply waited, patient as old debts, humming faintly at the edge of sound, ready for another bough to hesitate in the wrong place and pick it up again. The first sign that something had fastened itself to Eli Booker came quietly. In the days after the duel, he moved through the town and fields like a man walking under a sky no one else could see. He ate when food was set in front of him, slept when his body surrendered, answered when spoken to, but every act seemed to arrive a heartbeat late, as if some part of him waited for permission from elsewhere. The Reverend mistook it at first for grief. He spoke of repentance and the weight of witnessing death, invited his son to join him in extra prayer. Eli knelt when told, hands laced, head bowed, but his gaze drifted toward the windows whenever a breeze stirred. The slightest vibration in the glass made his shoulders tense. Nights were worse. Soft sounds in the house, mouse in the wall, rafters settling, tree branch brushing shingles expanded into a chorus only he could hear. Beneath each ordinary creak lay another tone, too low for anyone else to notice, that threaded through the darkness and tugged at his nerves. When he finally slept, his dreams carried him back to the clearing. Not to the duel itself, but to the moment just before, when the air thickened and something leaned close. He woke with his jaw clenched and his hands flexed as if still holding the bow. The fiddle remained in its case at the foot of his bed. He avoided opening it, but the avoidance was labor. At odd hours his gaze would snag on the latch and stay there, drawn as if by a magnet. Once, late at night, he rose and knelt before it, hands hovering above the wood, fingers trembling with the urge to lift the lid. He did not. Instead, he pressed the palms flat against the top until the urge passed, leaving his arms aching. In the morning, faint crescent impressions, marks of fingernails pressed hard enough to dent, were visible on the varnish. Outside the Booker home, the county began to behave as if a nail had been driven somewhere into its unseen frame. Small things shifted just enough to be noticed by those who paid attention to small things. Milk turned sour faster in certain kitchens, even when kept cool. Dogs lingered at thresholds, refusing to cross into rooms where they'd slept peacefully for years. Horses balked when led along the road that passed nearest the crossroads, choosing to skirt through ditch and bramble rather than set hooves on that stretch of packed clay. Their eyes rolled white, their flanks shuddered, as if they sensed an old predator crouched where human eyes saw only dust. Silas Reed's grave did not stay still either. The cedar post set to mark it should have stood straight for seasons before weather had its way. Yet within a month, it began to cant subtly toward the east, as though bowing. Lila May, worn hollow by loss but not by superstition, straightened it with her own hands, packing the base with fresh dirt and stones. Days later, it leaned again. Neighbors who visited noticed that the soil over the grave never seemed to settle flat. It rose and fell in a shallow ripple, as if breath moved just below. On Sundays, Mount Olive Baptist tried to proceed as it always had. Hymns were sung, sermons delivered, fans waved, children hushed. Yet something had altered the room. When the congregation lifted its collective voice, the old comfort did not come. Harmonies wobbled, rhythms drifted. Once, as the organist pressed the final chord of a familiar hymn, an extra pitch swelled above the rest, a piercing, dissonant thread that no hand had called forth. It hung for a moment, thin and sharp, then faded. Several heads turned at the same time toward Eli, who sat motionless in the front pew, eyes open but unfocused. Whispers began to gather around his name. People noticed that when he passed, conversations shortened to a few strained syllables. Some claimed the air grew a degree colder in his wake. Children were called indoors if he appeared at the end of a lane. It was not accusation they felt so much as caution, the old instinct that draws a circle around a man standing too close to lightning. The Reverend responded with more fervor. His sermons turned from general sin to the specific dangers of pacts made in ignorance. He spoke of temptation disguised as opportunity, of contests that wagered more than pride. The congregation heard an indictment that did not name his son but traced his outline in the air. Beneath his anger lay fear, a deep, unspoken dread that his house had become an address written in a stranger's book. Meanwhile, reports from the Crossroads continued. Travelers who tried to cut through after sundown came back with stories of lantern light where no lanterns burned, of a figure glimpsed at the far edge of the clearing. Tall, lean, too still to be human, its outline indistinct yet oppressive. Some described the smell of hot metal on a cool night. Others noted the absence of sound, a muffled quality, as if they had stepped briefly into a room padded with velvet. A few insisted they had heard faint scraping, like the drag of a bow over a string just beyond hearing. None lingered long enough to investigate. A farmer's daughter, sent with a basket to a neighbor whose path skirted the area, cut across the edge of the clearing to save time. When she returned, her dress was smeared with clay, and her basket empty. She could not explain what had happened to the bread and preserves she carried. The last thing she recalled clearly was the sensation of stopping mid-step because a scrap of melody had brushed her ear. The next memory was of walking out of the trees empty-handed, cheeks stiff with dried tears. She insisted she had not cried. The stains insisted otherwise. Rumors spread that offerings were being taken. Chickens left too near the fork in the road went missing, with no feathers or tracks to mark their fate. A stray hound that had taken to bedding near Silas's grave vanished one night. The rope snapped, the ground around his last sleeping place unmarred. Old women nodded grimly, saying that where something powerful has been called, something hungry often waits in its shadow. Eli's unease deepened into something more visible. He began waking with his hands raw, palms abraded as if they had spent hours gripping something rough. On nights when the wind rose, neighbors heard faint strains of music drifting from the Booker house despite no light burning in Eli's room. One boy, restless with curiosity, crept close enough to peer through the cracked shutters. He saw Eli seated on the edge of the bed, fiddle case open, the instrument lying across his knees. The bow hung in the air, a few inches above the strings, moving back and forth with precise, measured strokes. No sound emerged. The boy fled and told no one for weeks, hoping that not naming it would make it untrue. There were times when Eli fought back. He avoided gatherings where music might be played, kept distance from fiddlers and banjos, chose chores that put an axe or a plow in his hands instead of a bow. For brief stretches, normalcy returned. He spoke more, worked harder, even smiled in a way that resembled his old self. Then some small stimulus, a wagon wheel squealing at the right pitch, a screen door slamming with a curious rhythm, a train whistle cutting the air in a familiar interval would halt him mid-motion. His eyes would cloud, and his right hand would twitch toward an invisible neck. The wider county adapted in its own way. Children were warned more sternly about wandering after dark. The Crossroads received a new kind of respect. Farmers began to spit or cross themselves when passing it, hedging their theology with habit. Some refused to acknowledge any change, to admit that a single night's music could alter the character of land. Yet even they took longer routes home unconsciously, feet choosing detours while mouths insisted nothing was wrong. Every so often, a stranger came through. Drummers for traveling shows, patent medicine, men with bright wagons, itinerant musicians following rumor of coin. When talk reached them of the duel and the tune, some laughed and asked to be shown the place, the way men laugh in the face of stories they half believe and hope to disprove. Those who persisted and stood there found their jokes thinning. The clearing looked ordinary enough, pines, dirt, the faint imprint of an old circle now blurred by rain. But the longer they remained, the more their instruments sat oddly in their hands. Fiddle players found their tuning drifting toward a tension they had not chosen. Guitarists strummed chords that seemed to ask for a note not on the fretboard. A few left abruptly and, weeks later, mentioned that certain patterns had begun to show up in their sets uninvited, small curls of melody that made audiences lean forward and then frown. For the people who lived in the shadow of those pines, the conclusion grew harder to avoid. The duel had not been a simple contest between two young men. It had been an opening. Pride on one side and wounded faith on the other had drawn a doorway in sound and left it ajar. Something had stepped close enough to mark its claim. It was not a dramatic possession, the sort told in lurid pamphlets and barnside cautionary tales. It was quieter, a slow annexing of spaces, a road, a grave, a house, a heart. The devil, in these parts, had long been described in fiery language and broad strokes. Horns, tail, trident, roaring laughter over a lake of flames. The shape that hovered now at the edge of men's sleep bore little resemblance to that caricature. It felt instead like a presence seated just beyond the circle of light at any gathering, head inclined, listening. It did not demand open worship. It seemed content with attention, every fearful glance toward the crossroads, every sudden silence when a fiddle hit a certain note, every unspoken thought about bargains and what might be worth the cost. Eli carried that presence more closely than anyone. It rode behind his eyes and in the small hesitations of his hand. Whether he had won or lost the duel no longer mattered. The devil's claim, if claim it was, did not rest on victory. It rested on participation. A line had been crossed, a sound released, and now the county lived with the echo, each resident a potential string waiting to be plucked. Time did not soften the edges of what had happened at Booker's Crossroads. It simply laid years over the memory, the way pine needles fall one layer after another while the ground beneath remains disturbed. In the months following the duel, life in the county tried to resume its familiar rhythm. Fields plowed, crops harvested, babies born, old folks buried. But something beneath that surface had shifted. The place carried a faint aftertaste of ash, an undertone no amount of rain or sunlight could scrub away. Silas Reed's absence grew louder with each season. Weddings lost some of their laughter. Wakes felt heavier. Dances continued, but no fiddler in the county dared attempt certain runs or ornaments, afraid the wrong note might tip over into something summoned. The younger players learned by example. Avoid the high-held intervals. Avoid the places where a melody could flicker into the ghost of the Crossroads tune. Even those who had scoffed at superstition tuned their strings with a new care. Hands moving slower, more reverent, as if sensing that music itself had developed a memory. Silas's mother aged quickly. Her hair, once salt and pepper, silvered in a single winter. People left food at her door in quiet gestures of respect, but she often failed to answer knocks. Some said she spent hours sitting beside the grave, fingertips pressed to the cedar post, murmuring the names of songs Silas had played as a boy. Others claimed she no longer spoke at all, that she had slipped into a silence so deep even grief could not reach her. The land around her cabin began to behave oddly, peach blossoms arriving too early, crows avoiding the yard, the well water turning clear as glass, no matter how heavy the rains. Those who believed in signs said the earth was refusing to forget the weight it had swallowed. The Crossroads itself began to draw travelers the way peculiar places often do. At first, they came only from nearby towns, curious young men looking to prove bravery, girls whispering behind their hands, older folks determined to measure the truth for themselves. They rarely stayed long. Some returned with soft-spoken accounts of the way the air thickened along the tree line. Others spoke of lantern-like flickers appearing without source, hovering low to the ground. A few admitted the wrongness outright. Footsteps behind them when no second set of prints followed. The sensation of being observed from the shadows despite no figure present. One farmhand, passing through on his way to Macon, swore that the ground had trembled once under his heel, as if a breath had been drawn beneath the surface. Another, more cautious man said he had heard the faint scrape of bow on string, so soft he had questioned his senses until the melody repeated in a rhythm he could not have imagined. When asked to hum it, his mouth shaped silence. It was not forgetfulness that stopped him. It was refusal. What remained consistent in all these stories was the lack of birdsong. In spring, when the canopy should have burst with calls, the clearing stayed unnaturally quiet. Even insects seemed to skirt the place. Grass grew but flattened in odd spirals, as though pressed down by something weightless yet insistent. The 4 tall pines still marked the compass points, but their bark developed narrow, vertical scars, clean lines, smooth to the touch, too deliberate for lightning, too uniform for animals. Years carried the county into a new era. The railroad expanded, more families moved in, and the war that came later reshaped the land yet again. But even young men who had grown up hearing only fragments of the story treated the Crossroads with inherited caution. The tune lived on in the way warnings travel, not through instruction, but through pauses in conversation, glances toward the trees, and a collective instinct to steer clear of an old wound. Some say the first full echo of the duel's music appeared 12 years later, a group of field workers resting. At dusk reported hearing a sudden vibration in the air, like the hum of a plucked string magnified across the field. The sound stretched, thickened, and for a heartbeat carried the unmistakable contour of a rising fiddle phrase, sharp, mournful, cut short. Every man in the group froze, their breaths synchronized in the stillness. Then the sound vanished. Not faded, vanished, as if someone had severed it mid-note. Children born long after Silas's death grew up hearing adults refer to that place in the pines the way sailors speak of reefs. Something was there, something waited. The story became part of the county's marrow. Other echoes surfaced farther from the Crossroads. At a revival meeting in a neighboring town, a visiting musician tried to lead a hymn, but slipped inadvertently into a strange minor progression that unnerved the choir. The melody was unfamiliar, but the weight of it, the feeling of something leaning close, struck several listeners at once. They fell, silent mid-verse. When the musician realized what had emerged from his fingers, he stopped playing entirely. He later claimed he had not learned the pattern anywhere, that it had reached up through him like a memory that was not his. In Macon, a street fiddler performing outside the depot suddenly found his bow hand drifting into a sequence he had never practiced. The train whistle blared overhead, but those within earshot heard the figure clearly. One old man, sitting on a bench nearby, stood abruptly and walked away without explanation, as though fleeing from a truth arriving on a tide of sound. The county's relationship to Eli grew more complicated as the years unfolded. He remained a quiet, solitary figure, never truly outcast, but never welcomed fully back into the fold. He worked odd jobs, kept to the edges of gatherings, avoided any road that curved toward the crossroads. Some days he carried his fiddle slung over his back. Some days he left it untouched for weeks. His face kept its youth longer than expected, but his eyes carried an exhaustion that belonged to older men. People claimed the air dimmed slightly when he passed, the way a storm dims a field before it breaks. A handful of residents told of seeing him at dusk, standing at the border of the clearing, not entering but watching, as though awaiting instruction from a shadow that never fully showed itself. Others said they saw him flinch when a wagon wheel hit a pothole at a certain pitch. Children, braver in daylight than wisdom allowed, threw glances toward him and whispered that the devil had not taken his soul outright but marked him for later. Stories layered over each other. Some said Eli had survived the duel only because the entity wanted him awake. Others said he had not survived at all in any way that mattered. A quieter rumor held that he was being used as a vessel for the tune itself, carrying it from season to season until the moment came for it to be played again properly, fully, disastrously. The older folks paid closest attention. They noticed patterns younger ears missed. Sudden silences at twilight. Shifts in wind that carried no scent. Nights when the frogs fell quiet in unison. They recognized the shape of a place that had been changed. The crossroads had become a hinge between worlds. The tune, whatever its origin, had become a key. Generations passed, and people from outside the county began to take interest in the legend. Folklorists, song chasers, and wandering musicians arrived, hoping to hear the fabled strain. They never did. The land did not perform for outsiders. Yet those who stayed long enough began noticing subtler signs. The way cicadas paused mid-chorus, the way dust lifted on windless days, the way the pines creaked with the rhythm of a bow stroke. The echo persisted, not constant but recurring, like a memory the land refused to let slip, and with each appearance, the same unspoken truth settled deeper into the county's bones. The duel had not ended in the moment it fell silent. It continued in the spaces between seasons, in the hush before a storm, in the breath held by pines at dusk. The tune had not died. It had merely gone quiet, waiting for fingers willing to finish what Silas and Eli had begun, whether by courage, by madness, or by the devil's patient hand. Years softened the details, but not the weight of the night when the devil's tune first bled into the Georgia pines. As new families arrived, older families faded, and the county shifted through wars, droughts, and modernity. The crossroads never lost its peculiar stillness. Roads were widened, barns raised and fallen. Stores opened and closed, but the clearing remained untouched, as if the land itself guarded it from the hands of men. Even those who did not know the story instinctively walked around it, the same way a mule avoids a snake hidden in grass. Children grew into adults, hearing pieces of the tale, some from relatives, some from porch and conversations drifting through screen doors, some from the way elders tightened their jaws at the mention of Crossroads fiddlers. The full account rarely passed intact to any one listener. Instead, the legend lived through tone, through the way a voice dropped lower when speaking of certain nights, through the way an adult's eyes flicked to the tree line when a fiddle in the distance struck an unsettling run. Folks learned to read the signs long before they heard the full story. Eventually, the land around Booker's Crossroads changed ownership. Surveyors from Macon arrived with maps and markers, hoping to parcel the area for timber or farming. But each time they attempted to drive a stake into the soil near the center of the clearing, something interfered. Tools snapped with clean breaks, compasses spun, and the men felt an odd pressure in the ears as though standing too close to a high mountain drop. Most kept their heads down and their comments to themselves. Practical men do. not speak lightly of things they do not understand, especially not in the deep South, where silence can be a kind of reverence. Eli Booker grew into an adult, shaped by shadows. He married late quietly and worked a small piece of land on the far edge of the county, well beyond the reach of the Crossroads. His house was modest, his appearance unremarkable except for a stillness in his posture that unsettled visitors. He rarely played the fiddle anymore. When he did, the sound was careful, steady, and constrained, as though he were holding back some greater force that waited behind the wood. He lived without children. Some whispered it was his choice. Others murmured that something in him had been dimmed or taken. His wife never spoke publicly of the odd nights when the wind circled the house in a pattern that had no relation to the weather. She never mentioned the times Eli sat awake until dawn, staring into the dark, fingers twitching at invisible strings. But she grew old with a kind of patience that suggested she shared more with him than marriage. Eli died quietly, decades after the duel. His funeral drew a small crowd, neighbors, distant cousins, a handful of men who remembered the old days with more nostalgia than precision. The reverend had long since passed, the church rebuilt twice by generations who knew nothing of the tension between scripture and sound. When Eli's coffin was lowered into the earth, the wind rose suddenly and dropped again, a brief tremor that caused the younger mourners to glance upward. The older ones exchanged slow, knowing looks. They had lived long enough to recognize acknowledgments when they came. After Eli's death, strange patterns returned to the county. For a brief span of months, travelers reported hearing a thin line of music on moonless nights, no more than a breath of melody, rising like steam from the soil. It curled through the fields, caught in the branches of the pines, and vanished before a man could identify its source. Some said it sounded like a memory trying to speak. Others said it sounded like someone finishing a tune that had been interrupted for half a lifetime. Silas Reed's grave, long neglected by time and weather, remained oddly untouched. The cedar post marking it eventually rotted, but the earth beneath did not collapse. Wildflowers grew around it each spring, never directly on it, forming a ring of color that resembled a wreath laid by invisible hands. The Reed cabin fell to ruin. Vines consumed the porch, and saplings pushed through the floorboards. Yet the air inside always felt warmer than the forest around it, as if a presence lingered, watchful but not malicious. Folklorists arrived now and then, clipboards in hand, ears hungry for ghost stories. They interviewed the old-timers, recorded scraps of memory, argued over the dates, the causes, the nature of the tune. They left with notebooks half-filled and expressions half-satisfied, sensing they had touched only the outline of something deeper. None stayed long enough to understand the real lesson. The story never belonged merely to Silas or Eli. It never belonged to the Reeds or the Bookers, or even the county. It belonged to the land that had listened to pride swelling between two young men. Land that had borne witness to something stepping close when music called too boldly. And once the land learns a song, it does not forget it. It waits. Years later, when a new generation of fiddlers emerged, boys who learned tunes from radio instead of front porches, girls who carried their instruments in canvas cases instead of burlap sacks, certain phrases caused discomfort. A run too sharp, a slide too long, a bow stroke that rose too high in the treble register. Teachers gently corrected them. Not with warnings, not with superstition, just with soft instruction, the kind shaped by instinct. Don't play it that way. They did not mention why. Modern times layered pavement and power lines over parts of the county, but Booker's Crossroads remained untouched, an anomaly left out of progress. Some said the soil was too stubborn for foundations. Others said the county survey simply overlooked that corner. But those who grew up there knew better. They knew that a place remembers the night music summoned something that listened back. The lesson, shaped over decades, settled into the community like a quiet covenant. Music is powerful. Music is sacred. Music can open doors as easily as it can close them. The devil, if one believed in such a figure, did not always approach with fire and threat. Sometimes he came as curiosity, drawn by the boldness of a man who played without fear. But the deepest truth lay not in the devil at all, nor in the tune, nor even in the duel. It lay in the dangerous beauty of talent, unchecked of pride, rising faster than wisdom, of a gift so fierce it tempted the world beyond the one men could see. Silas had been all brilliance and hunger. Eli had been all conviction and yearning. Both had carved a crack between realms. The music had merely followed the line they drew. The story endured because it warned without scolding. It whispered to each generation that skill demands humility, that ambition must balance with reverence, and that some crossroads should be passed quietly, head bowed, footsteps light, and on rare nights, when moonlight was thin and the pines leaned as though listening, the faint tremble of a bowstroke drifted across the fields once again. Not enough to frighten, just enough to remind. The lesson buried in the pines never stopped speaking, because some tunes aren't meant to be played. Some tunes are meant to watch who dares try.